just in touch with a Bolivian journalist who gave me kind of a rundown on the situation, but he's been actually, he has family inside the country in La Paz, but he is unable to get there into the country because of the regime change that's taking place in real time. And one of the reasons he's unable to go back is that he's considered a leftist, and there are right-wing mobs in the street who are purging the movement towards socialism's support base with the insistence of the army. The army is completely united behind the regime change plot. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But the reason he isn't going back right now is fear for his own safety and the fact that these putschist mobs are completely unhinged. Bolivia is sort of a small society. People know each other in La Paz, so he doesn't want to show his face. What we've seen today is a lot of resistance in the street from opponents of the coup. The indigenous population, union workers, people affiliated with the MAS party, the Masistas, and the resistance is more organized than in the last days, where you saw isolated acts of violence. The main social movements are really taking control of the resistance and are trying to make large parts of the country ungovernable. The country is currently not being governed. And in fact, what we saw in the Bolivian parliament, I think it was today, was the attempt by Juan Guaido with makeup, aka Janine Áñez, who is a coup leader, right-wing coup leader, to assume the presidency. She declared herself president, just like Juan Guaido. Unfortunately for her, all members of MAS, Evo Morales' party, were not present and rejected this completely unconstitutional act. So they didn't even participate in the vote. So her presidency is currently unconstitutional. This is someone who has made racist, anti-indigenous comments on camera. There's video going around of her saying, we don't want the Wipala flag anymore. And this is a flag that's a symbol of the indigenous nation to which Evo Morales and a large portion of Bolivia's population belongs. And we've seen in recent days, especially in separatist areas like Santa Cruz, we've seen that flag be burned. We've seen members of the military and police take that flag off of their sleeves because that flag was incorporated into the Bolivian flag as part of Morales' plurinational vision to incorporate a large portion of the Bolivian population that had been completely left out under previous governments like those of Carlos Mesa, the neoliberal Washington-linked figure who is now basically the opposition's de facto candidate, or at least ran as the candidate. So then you have Camacho. You have Luis Fernando Camacho, and he is sort of the authentic face and voice of the coup. In the past 3 days, we've seen him attempt to sort of moderate his tone since he appeared in the presidential palace above the presidential seal, laying a Bible over the national symbol and declaring that, we will cast Satan out of this burned palace and that we don't want Pachamama, who is the indigenous earth god, as part of the country anymore. And, Ben and I wrote about what an extreme figure Camacho is, how he's actually the former leader of a far-right, objectively fascist paramilitary whose members are known for their Nazi salutes and racist violence in Santa Cruz, which is the center of, wealth and I guess you could say whiteness in Bolivia, colonial nostalgia. This is an area where the U.S. has worked to encourage separatism. So Camacho is now kind of touting his ties to indigenous forces, because there is one small indigenous group that actually appeared with him at his La Paz rally, to which Carlos Mesa was not even invited, and trying to affect a more moderate stance, calling on people to respect the laws and not carry out the violence that he whipped up in the past few days. Today, we also saw the dramatic scene of Evo Morales arriving in Mexico He was barely spirited out of the country thanks to the good work of the Mexican Foreign Ministry. And he landed in Mexico City and recalled, as soon as he got onto the tarmac, the violence that he and his supporters have faced over the past few days. His sister's house was ransacked. The electoral committees were destroyed. Vote counting machinery was destroyed. His supporters were shot. His own home was ransacked. Governors' homes were burned, and many people were threatened around him into acceding to the coup. He also mentioned that members of the military were offered $50,000 to turn on him. Now, this brings us to another issue, which is the issue of U.S. support for the coup. I saw some ridiculous post on Facebook by some academic in New York who said, I don't really notice any, U.S. hand here. There was a big coalition out in the streets, and we're denying the agency of the people. He's one of the agency mongers. And he called Ben Norton, Ben, who's here with us, just to not confuse Ben with, Ben Franklin or Uncle Ben or anyone else. He called Ben an Orientalist tanky for, opposing the coup. Supporting the legitimate democratic rule of the first indigenous president.
Well, because I recognize that there's other agencies, like the Central Intelligence Agency, there's 100% chance that the Central Intelligence Agency is involved, and they're the ones denying the Bolivian people their agency.
I don't want to get too far afield and focus on one person, but I got into a little Twitter exchange with this individual, and he told me he was agnostic on whether or not to call it a military coup. And he was waiting for more evidence. So hopefully he's tuning in. But Max, you were saying.
He's definitely certain and completely confident in appealing to the sensibilities of other blue checkmark pundits. But leaving that aside, Ben, we should address that particular agency. The CIA, as we know from Philip Agee, who was really the first major CIA whistleblower, works through other agencies to sort of soften the blow of its meddling. So one group it works through often is the U.S. Agency for International Development, and this group has pumped millions of dollars into Bolivia. This has been well established thanks to Chelsea Manning, who's in jail, and the cables that she leaked to Julian Assange, who's in jail. And we know that they've specifically earmarked funding for indigenous groups opposed to Morales. They've earmarked funding for the separatist groups in Santa Cruz, including the Santa Cruz Coordination Committee that was led by Luis Fernando Camacho. This is consistent with what Washington does around the world to encourage separatism within countries that are independent and not absorbed into the empire. You can look at what they're doing in Hong Kong and Xinjiang around China as a perfect example of that, or what they've done in the Balkans. And I think one of the most fascinating components of the piece that we published yesterday on Camacho is how, first of all, in Santa Cruz, you have this landed oligarchic elite, which comes partly from Croatia, who left Croatia during World War II because many of them were Nazi collaborators with the Ustasha fascist movement, which met with Hitler. It's like I put a picture of Hitler in this piece, and it wasn't even a stretch. It's like, you're connected to Hitler, okay? This coup is connected, through several degrees of separation, but not many. It's not like the Kevin Bacon game, to Adolf Hitler.
No, this is like the only time where Godwin's law actually understandably applies. It's not like, you're like Hitler, or I dislike you. It's like, no, literally, there are 2 degrees of separation to Hitler here.
Yeah, it wasn't Godwin's law. It was just factual reporting. So the Ustasha, have people who left when Tito came to power after World War II in Yugoslavia, and took their money to Bolivia. It's why people like Klaus Barbie, who was a Gestapo torturer who tortured French communists and whose services were repurposed by the CIA to carry out Operation Condor, preventing communist infiltration into Latin America. Why Klaus Barbie felt so comfortable when he fled to Bolivia in the 1950s, and he would see the Bolivian military and people marching through the streets of La Paz with Nazi-style uniforms on, because many of them were former collaborators or families from Germany or the Balkan area. So back to the Croatia connection, you have people like this guy who was the ringleader of an assassination plot against Evo Morales in 2009, and we'll get into that more. His name was Rosa Flores, and he himself founded the international brigade of the Croatian forces that helped balkanize Yugoslavia in NATO's war in Yugoslavia, and then became involved in this plot over a decade later, actually 15 years later, to kill Evo Morales, and he himself was killed in that plot. Then you have the mentor of Luis Fernando Camacho, who is a Croatian Bolivian named Marinkovic, who is one of the biggest landowners, if not the biggest landowner, in Santa Cruz, and was his predecessor at the Santa Cruz Coordination Committee. So all of these factors come together, and it's so interesting because they're exporting a U.S. operation, a U.S. separatist operation in post-Cold War Yugoslavia to Bolivia, and very few people even understand that connection. So of course you don't see that there's a U.S. hand here, but the most direct U.S. hand, and this isn't out yet, but I'm editing a piece, we're going to put it up tonight, about the role of the School of the Americas in this whole operation. And this is, I think, where you see the most direct U.S. involvement, because who demanded that Evo Morales step down? It was the military leadership and the police. And we can establish, and we will establish, that the leadership, the Bolivian police and the Bolivian military, down to the chief of staff of the military, have been participants in training programs overseen by the U.S., such as the School of the Americas at Fort Bragg, which we all know is the training ground for all of the right-wing juntas that we're familiar with over the past decades and during the Cold War. There's, of course, School of the Americas Watch, so we've been able to cross-check names. And then we have, this piece is not by me, by the way, but I don't want to sell out the piece before we publish it. And then you have various exchange programs for Latin American police officers that are run out of Washington by the FBI. And so I was mentioning Philip Agee. He demonstrated in the 70s how the CIA often uses the FBI and other agencies to conceal its fingerprints. And that's what's gone on here. They've trained these figures, put them in the most important places in the Brazilian government. Of course, they're unelected. And these are the characters who dealt the final blow to Evo Morales, who said that he was almost killed and he owes his life to the Mexican president for rescuing him. So that's the situation as I see it. And I don't think anyone knows what's going to happen in the coming days. The situation, as my Bolivian source told me, is fluid. Evo Morales said that he left to avoid violence, but it seems that some sort of violence could be inevitable, particularly from the right wing.
Max, you talking about this forthcoming report on the Grayzone about how the U.S. trained some of the key military officials who were involved in this coup reminds me of another coup that you covered back when it happened in 2004 in Haiti, when a lot of the key officials there also were involved and linked to U.S. training and support. You reported on this back when it happened at the time. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the parallels there between what's happening now, what happened in Haiti.
Yeah, I reported on that back in the days of dial-up internet. It was like, okay, waiting to learn about the coup. And I had a stack of papers next to me. There wasn't a whole lot online. I was using LexisNexis a lot, but I was also making a lot of phone calls to Haiti and getting a lot of sources, including people like, I think, I'm going to get his name wrong because it's been so long, but Jean Dominique, one of these, I think he was jailed or killed recently. But the actual gunman who overthrew the elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide.
Guy Philippe, sorry.
Yeah, they were talking to me. And so first of all, Aristide, who is a liberation theology preacher, he created the Lavalas movement. It's, a lot like Haiti's version of the Sandinistas or the Chavistas of Venezuela. They wanted to run out the Tonton Macoute of the previous dictatorships of the Duvalier. And, this is the urban poor and the rural farmers mostly. And so they were obviously a threat to U.S. control over Haiti. So during the first coup, Aristide was ousted by figures trained at the School of the Americas, very much like what just happened in Bolivia. But then he went through an interesting period where you had the Black Congressional Caucus coming in and chaining themselves to the White House. Bill Clinton was president. This is an important part of his base. So he agreed to send Aristide back, which just shows you the level of U.S. control over Haiti, now facing another uprising. And Aristide's sent back after agreeing to all of these free trade deals so that, Haiti has to import rice, which was one of its main cash crops from Louisiana. The economy is basically, the indigenous economy is destroyed. And then, Jesse Helms is the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So they begin to sanction the hell out of Haiti and, suspend all supplies of any arms the police could have used. So Aristide couldn't protect himself when these guys came bearing down on him with like a bunch of, Enfield rifles. He had to actually hire a private mercenary company to prevent himself from being killed. And one of the and the most important element of the second coup that removed Aristide was the National Endowment for Democracy, which is another CIA cutout run much like USAID that funds civil society groups and media in countries where the U.S. wants regime change. And they funded a group called the Group of 184 in Haiti. And it was basically 184 small political factions, basically everyone who was left out by Lavalas, but especially, what's known in Haiti as the morally repugnant elites. So like sweatshop owners like Charles Bacoeur, and figures who are now behind a lot of the corruption people are protesting against. And what they would do was they'd do these provocative events where they'd march through Cité Soleil, which was a huge base of Lavalas, and try to stir up violence, they would boycott every election. And then the U.S. would come in through Bush's State Department, and they'd say, well, this election is illegitimate. It's clear that this government is authoritarian, which is exactly what we see take place in Venezuela. It's just like a cut and paste regime change operation. And Stanley Lucas was their main point man in Haiti. He was being paid by the International Republican Institute, then chaired by John McCain. His family were the landed elite. They had massacred peasants on their land. And he was just kind of running around spearheading the whole operation personally. In Bolivia, we now have someone who's maybe not playing as important a role, but is playing a very public role and is an agent of destabilization that we've exposed at the Grayzone, named Janice Vaca Daza. And she works for a group that has a terrible record in the region, Venezuela especially, but also in Bolivia, called the Human Rights Foundation. And the Human Rights Foundation takes the same role as the National Endowment for Democracy, but it's not directly operating under the auspices of the U.S. government. So it's like 1 degree removed, which allows much more freedom of operation, less, I would say, less accountability by Congress. It's not that they apply very much accountability to this at all, when like the New York Times supports every regime change operation. But they were founded by someone named Thor Halvorsen. His father was a right-wing Venezuelan politician who was a CIA asset and was an oligarch. And Halvorsen was a campus Republican activist. When he got out of college, he started he founded this group with money from Peter Thiel, who's this, the right-wing Silicon Valley billionaire who said that he opposes democracy and women shouldn't have the right to vote. He has like the right-wing foundations are supporting him, but also he's gotten support from Amnesty International, a lot of liberal groups, and he has what's called Davos for Dissidents, where all of these regime change activists from around the world get in a room every year in Oslo and start exchanging tactics. And I think this is why we see so many of the same tactics in Hong Kong, Ukraine, and so many in Venezuela and so many of these places. And Daza poses, she's a Human Rights Foundation Freedom Fellow. She was trained through this group run at Harvard. That was such an obvious, operation. It was basically just set up for her through Sergej Popovich, who's another regime change trainer who helped train Juan Guaido. And she helped launch the coup in August. I don't know if everyone remembers, but there were all these protests that started out against Bolsonaro when the Amazon was on fire. And the protests were then they took an off-ramp thanks to the work of Daza, who started this SOS Bolivia hashtag online through her NGO Rios de Pi. And they began protesting in Europe and the US outside the Bolivian embassy and trying to blame Morales. And she said that, she's a nonviolent kind of environmental activist. She's been trained in nonviolence at Kent State, she said. She studied it. But all of a sudden, in the past weeks, we started to see her at the barricades alongside these right-wing fascistic forces of Luis Fernando Camacho. And so the mask was completely lifted. And now she's just basically cheering on the regime change operation the whole time, when a few months ago, the BBC was saying, environmental activist Janice Daza says that there should be more aid. So the coup has progressed through various stages. And now the mask is off on her, on the Human Rights Foundation, obviously doesn't favor human rights. It's a regime change foundation. And finally, one thing that we reported in our piece.
To jump in really quickly, Max, actually, we have right now, Janice Daza was just on CNN to push this coup propaganda, and she quoted MLK. Well,
she compared it to what's happening to the U.S. civil rights movement. It's like this racist coup where they're burning indigenous flags. She compared it to getting beaten at lunch counters to protest segregation, and that's just, how is that allowed to happen?
And another point to mention here, actually, which we disclose in this article you can find at the Grayzone, and I had it up for people who were looking at the live stream here. And what's another crazy thing is she did a TED Talk, and her TED Talk on resisting authoritarianism in Bolivia was sponsored by the Spanish embassy. So, it's pretty clear that when you're a Bolivian and your event on the supposed dictatorship of your democratically elected government is sponsored by Spain, which colonized Bolivia, it's not a very good look.
It's also that, when you do a TED Talk, you're an asshole. Just period. But so the final point I was going to make was that, the Human Rights Foundation has been active in Bolivia for a long time. And I talked about this assassination plot that involved 4 dual nationals from either Hungary and Croatia or Ireland, who were just known fascists. But allegedly, according to the government investigation of the coup, Hugo Aja Melgar, who was the founder of the Human Rights Foundation's subsidiary in Bolivia, was the one who brought Rosa, the coup leader, and he had to Aja had to take asylum in the U.S. The U.S. government immediately gave him asylum, and he had to flee because of his implication in this assassination and terror plot. That's there it is. Janice Daza's predecessor in Bolivia was implicated in a plot to kill Evo Morales, and now here she is at the barricades and cheering on this regime change operation. And this group, just look at coverage outside of alternative media about it. I've been writing about them for years, but just check out your New York Times and Washington Post, BBC coverage of this group. It's just referred to in the same terms as Amnesty International. It's just another human rights group. So people, again, if you don't see the U.S. hand in this coup, it's because you have blinders on. It's just right there before your eyes.
Ben, let me put to you some of the talking points that we've heard from people who have been either justifying this coup or at least lending tacit support to it. So one of them is that Evo Morales fraudulently, they say, extended his term. So there was a referendum on whether or not he could run for another term. he lost, and then a Supreme Court, even though he lost narrowly, the Brazilian Supreme Court ruled that he could run again, and he did, and he won the first round. So,
well, yeah, we want to respond to people. We're reading your comments here, by the way.
So the commenter, Render Unto Caesar, writes, can you speak to the claims that Morales packed the Supreme Court, which ruled in his favor, to allow him to seek another term? I heard people claiming it was illegal for him to pack the court.
No, well, first of all, I mean, this reminds me of how when you have a Democratic president and there's an open seat in the Supreme Court, someone dies, and then the Democratic president tries to install someone in the Supreme Court, they're accused of stacking the court. That's how the government works. When you're president, you can put people in the Supreme Court. That's not stacking the court. But then we have these Democratic presidents in the U.S., these neoliberal centrists who are cowards. And in the case of Obama, had this open seat and he didn't fill it, and then Trump filled it. Yeah. So it's like the right wing does it because that's what the president does, is that they're allowed to put people in the Supreme Court. So the thing about Morales is that he always operated within the confines, strictly within the confines of the law in Bolivia. He was democratically elected in 3 presidential elections. He won numerous democratic referenda, and he usually won those in landslides. By the way, Evo Morales is the first president in Bolivia's history to ever get more than 50% of the vote in an election. He's by far the most popular leader in Bolivia's history. He's, of course, the only indigenous leader in Bolivia's history. This is a majority indigenous country. And this isn't to mention all of the things he did to benefit his population. He dropped poverty by more than 60%, extreme poverty by more than 60%, and poverty by more than 40%. He expanded social programs and education. He created a universal healthcare system similar to the kind of Medicare for all system that Bernie Sanders wants to create, right? And what's really incredible is that anytime he won an election, they said, oh, it was fraudulent, even though, of course, it was a democratic, fair election. Anytime he put someone in the Supreme Court, oh, he's stacking the court. And then finally, when the Supreme Court says he can run again, once again, you hear people say, oh, that he wasn't allowed to do that. So it's an example of how at every turn he was always stymied, but he was nothing remotely like a dictator. You know, the Organization of American States, which is a puppet of the U.S., Luis Almagro has repeatedly defended U.S. intervention in Latin America. In fact, when the U.S. invaded Panama, he said, oh, that wasn't an invasion. The U.S. was intervening to restore democracy. I mean, this is a guy who is a blatant puppet. And the OAS claimed they saw irregularities in the election. They couldn't cite any evidence of that. Meanwhile, actual experts at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, CEPR, published a very good report, which I can get up here, that looked at a statistical analysis of the publicly available voting data, because the voting data in Bolivia can be accessed by anyone in the world. They found no evidence of irregularities or fraud. So the OAS claimed that without any evidence. The actual independent experts looked to it and found no evidence. So there's no evidence of any of this. These are talking points used. And by the way, if we're talking about irregularities in elections, no country is immune to that. Let's talk about the United States and its irregularities, where the last Republican presidents that won didn't win the popular vote. And let's talk about Florida in the case of the Bush election. I mean, talk about irregularities and stolen elections. So this idea that Bolivia was a rigged democracy, but the U.S. is a perfect, great democracy and the beacon of freedom. I mean, I know our listeners don't believe that, but the people who are saying these talking points, saying that Morales is a dictator, they believe that the U.S. is some great beacon of democracy. I mean,
It sounds.
Well, and the thing is, it's not just Republicans that do it. Really, every person in power in the world is going to put people in a court who support their political line. That's called doing politics. And within a democratic system, if you do it democratically, that's not illegal. But the thing is that so many Democrats are just neoliberal centrist cowards who are afraid of exercising power, and they want to meet people in the middle, which was Obama's entire eight years. But we also want to respond to, we have a lot of comments here, and we're going to talk more about Bolivia. Because, if you don't deny it, it's obvious proof, as in the case of when Hillary Clinton said that Tulsi Gabbard was a Russian agent, and then someone went on it was MSNBC, and they said, well, she didn't deny it.
Yes.
All right, well... In that case, according to that logic, Hillary Clinton is a Russian agent, obviously. She never denied it.
Sorry, people are saying they lost Max's audio. So in case you missed it, Max went on the record and denied.
Wait, Max, you should go back. Max, go back to you. Your audio wasn't working. Back to Max.
Do I have audio now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just denying a commenter asking or accusing me of being a CIA Mossad info op. Clinton op too,
And that's why I made the joke.
At least, go back to the more familiar accusations of, being a Russian spy and stuff we're used to. I saw like the head of a Clinton super PAC claim that Glenn Greenwald was being, was a Russian asset, and just saying that in broad daylight. So, try to get with the times.
Fixed. Okay. Yes. So you just to confirm, people, you heard Max's on denial record that he is on record denial.
People are saying they can't really hear me that well.
Now they can.
Now they can.
We
got
hear
you now.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, Max is back. Yeah. That was obviously the CIA, obviously, because he was trying to say, I'm not a CIA agent, and then the CIA cut out his audio no. But all right, we're trying to respond to some of our comments here. First of all, I want to say thank you to all the commenters and everyone watching, but I also especially want to thank people, our super chat people who are giving us money here. We really appreciate it, and it is used to fund our journalism, so it means a lot. So thanks to Pal Sunt, thanks to Good Gorka, although it says message retracted, so I don't know if they wrote message retracted or if it was retracted by YouTube, in which case our corporate overlords are censoring you. So, Good Gorka, you can respond again, and we'll respond to that if it's within reason. Thanks to Briar2, and also here's Hero40. Words can't explain how important the work you all do. Thanks so much. It means a lot. It means a lot. Trying to respond to more comments here. There's so many, it's hard to keep up with. Thanks to Deanna Z there. The Oslo Freedom Forum, someone was talking about, which is run by Thor Halvorsen, which is this right-wing front group. And I'm glad we were talking about we talk about the Grayzone. We have a tag for the human rights industry because it's a really big industry. And what's interesting is during the Cold War, there was this big industry of like the anti-communist groups, the Soviet watch groups, like all these fake Soviet experts, and actually now that's kind of coming back with all the fake Russia experts and the fake terrorism experts. But now with the end of the Cold War, I mean, before Russiagate, since the end of the Cold War, there was like this human rights industry, and there were all these fake so-called human rights experts, and Oslo Freedom Forum is a great example of that, like these right-wing activists who are just neocon regime changers who use the pretext of so-called human rights to justify overthrowing whoever is the official enemy of the U.S. this week. Thanks to Neon Noir for the money as well in the super chat. Thanks to Deborah Slats. Thanks to everyone. I mean, again, we try to look at all the comments here. There's just so many. And yeah, someone else echoed smash that like button. So yeah, if you could like. So yeah, I don't know if either of you see some comments you want to respond to here.
Well, there's a question here, Ben, I think that you'd love to take, but I'm going to ask you to limit this because we want to keep the focus on Bolivia, but it is relevant to the Bolivia discussion, but I just feel like you can talk about this topic for 2 hours, so I'm going to give you a limit.
And it says,
I have a little announcement or an interesting update, which is that a Cocalero leader from the Coca Farmers Union that Evo originally was president of, and which was his base, has announced that mobilizations are going to be all out nationally, and their goal is to restore him to power by Monday. So the resistance has reached a point of national organization, and all of the social movements are fully invested in blocking this regime change operation. So I think what we're going to see unfold through the weekend is going to be extremely dramatic. Shades of Miraflores in Venezuela 2002.
Max, the bastion of support for Evo Morales, which is the majority of the country, according to the most recent election that got subverted, is it militarized at all? I mean, what happens when they come up against the military and the police forces, which, so far have been the ones driving the coup?
The military is going to try to break all of the indigenous roadblocks, where you have these massive caravans of indigenous people coming in to the cities, supporters of Morales and Mas, and we're going to see the army and police try to basically break their roadblocks. Those will be friction points of violence.
Yeah, and another point I wanted to respond to, because someone asked a comment about it, and it's actually a really good question, is about what's going to happen to all of the votes, because someone pointed out that Evo Morales got nearly 50% of the vote. And this is an interesting point, because I mentioned earlier that the Center for Economic and Policy Research, this think tank in DC, which is basically the only good think tank in DC, it's a small group that has very little funding, and it has some leading economic experts who are not just neoliberal propagandists. And they did a statistical analysis, and they found that there was no evidence of irregularities or fraud in the election. And they did a statistical analysis looking at the different stages of the vote count, right? Because there's this myth that supposedly this is the talking point used by the opposition and by corporate media, that the votes were coming in on vote night on October 20th, and that suddenly the vote count just went out, and then it came back hours later, and Morales was suddenly leading. That's not what happened. That wasn't the vote count. The way the Bolivian election works is they have a tally, which is like an estimate, but it's not a real vote count, and they have that unofficial estimate, which is like in the ballpark, before the actual count comes in throughout the night. And these economic experts did a statistical analysis, and they looked at if you look at the actual votes coming in, which started in the urban areas and then went out to the rural areas. The urban areas tend to be more pro-opposition, and the rural areas, which are largely indigenous, are more pro-Evo Morales. And they came in later in the night. So as the votes came in later in the night, the distance between Carlos Mesa, who is like the US-backed neoliberal opposition candidate, who honestly is not even really a key figure anymore in the coup, because the coup was led by the kind of far-right, the spear that broke the back of the government that was behind this coup. The muscle were the far-right forces, like the coup in Ukraine in 2014. But anyway, Carlos Mesa, who was the opposition candidate, he had about 37%, and Morales had about 47%. So 10.5%, nearly 11% more, which is why he won in the first round. Now, what's interesting is that even if you don't accept that fact, that it was a fair election and he won by the 10% required to not go to a runoff, let's give the opposition, even though it's not true, let's give them that as a talking point. That still ignores the fact that Evo Morales won the election in the first round and still has to go to a second round. And what's interesting is the opposition doesn't even dispute that fact. There's no evidence that they stacked the voting boxes. They don't claim that because they know that the opposition is not that popular. At most, they have the support of around 1/3 of the population. And Evo still would have gone to a second round. And Evo said, okay, even though the OAS is a biased pro-US organization, I agree they can do a vote audit. And I will respect what they say. And on the morning of the coup, the OAS called for a new election, and Evo Morales said, okay, fine, we will go to a new election. But the opposition response was, okay, we'll go to a new election, but you can't be the candidate. Which is an example of how at every single stage, the opposition has been preventing Evo from being able to participate in the democratic processes. It's so similar to the tactics used by the U.S.-backed right-wing opposition in Venezuela, where at every level they have refused to engage in democratic processes, they boycotted elections, they refuse to recognize Maduro as the elected president and as the candidate, because they know they can't win the election democratically, so they're trying to portray the government as authoritarian and dictatorial by withdrawing their supposed support or consent, as if you can do that, as you can say, oh, I don't recognize you as president, therefore you're a dictator. It was the same kind of tactics used in Bolivia, and of course it led to the coup, and suddenly the people who were calling for a new election just disappear, including the OAS, which said nothing for the entire night as the coup was happening, and then about 20 hours after the coup, finally the OAS released a statement saying, we support democratic processes, blah, 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 which is their essential way of saying, we allowed the coup to happen, and now we're going to pretend like we support democracy in this country.
I'm going to put a question to Max, and while Max is answering, we're going to work on some of the audio issues. I see your comments about it.
How's my audio? I mean, do I have an echo?
Your audio is fine when we're just on your shot, which we're about to do. So while you're talking, you'll be fine. So Max, we're getting a lot of questions about the role of lithium here. Bolivia claims to have about 70% of the world's lithium reserves. Just recently...
Well, no, Bolivia doesn't claim that. Actually, experts say international experts who say that Bolivia has 50 to 70% of the world's lithium reserves. And of course, lithium is used for batteries and electronics in cars, so you can keep it.
So Evo recently canceled a contract with a German company after there were some protests. To what extent do you think that factors in here, Max, a desire to grab Bolivia's lithium reserves?
Well, you can't have Teslas without lithium. The Tesla Model S has more than 7,000 individual batteries, each of which requires lithium. The entire battery pack is 1,200 pounds, and 15 pounds of that 1,200 pounds is lithium. So there's a piece at Bloomberg. We're going to need more lithium to meet electric car needs. Basically, we need lithium for the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is going to be a boon for mining. And much of that lithium, as this is from September 2017, much of that lithium's in Bolivia. Bloomberg provides a map, and the map just centers straight in on Bolivia. So is it a factor here? It's a factor, but so is natural gas. I mean, Evo Morales has nationalized the natural gas supply of Bolivia. And if you remember what happened to his predecessors, and I think it's actually more of a factor. First, you had the water uprising against Goni Sanchez de Losada, who is just a pure product of the Washington Consensus and the IMF imposed on Bolivia. And the first protests against him were because he tried to basically sell off the country's main water utility and privatize it and put it in the hands of Bechtel. Then he tries to take the country's natural gas because California was hungry for natural gas and ship it out through Chile in 2003, just completely selling out the country's assets. And of course, Bolivians and Chileans are historic enemies. Chile has taken Bolivia's sea access. So, he's run out. And as he's run out, the U.S. trained military and the security forces massacre over 70 people. There is evidence that was obtained by the Center for Constitutional Rights of Michael Ratner, that they actually had plans to kill thousands to suppress the rebellion, which wouldn't stop. Vice president at the time was Carlos Mesa, who's now the opposition's sort of handpicked candidate. And Mesa, 2 years later, was overthrown and chased out for basically assenting to the IMF's wishes and trying to sell off the country's natural gas. So this is the huge issue. This is the big issue. What does Luis Fernando Camacho, the face and voice of the coup, do? He is a lawyer and a businessman from a region of the country where the Camacho family basically runs a natural gas cartel. His father is involved in the natural gas industry. His cousins in the industry. His uncle, runs a facility. So what do they want? They want more profits. They want to stop nationalizing it and giving back the profits to the indigenous population who they regard as a satanic mass. So that's really what, to me, this is about. And I think lithium's absolutely an issue. But I mean, I'll hand it over to Ben, and I want Ben to talk about something else, which is the audio tapes, which appear to be real, which outline all of the coup plotting and coordination with people in Washington like Bob Menendez and Marco Rubio. Narco Rubio. And, I want you to address that. But first, what do you think about this lithium issue? And also, you've been kind of on Twitter kind of drawing the connection between the Green New Deal and the mining and you've been saying that it's going to be a boon for the mining industry, which might not mean that it's actually altogether environmentally beneficial. So I don't know if you can handle those three issues, but those are three things that I want to know more about.
Absolutely. So this is Ben here, and for those watching, I have up on the screen, it's in Spanish, but this is in the Spanish language media. There has been a series of articles published. It's of course curiously avoided the English language corporate media, but there's been a series of articles published looking at a series of 16 audio recordings that were leaked. And these audio recordings come from Bolivia before the election that Evo Morales that he won on October 20th. And what's interesting is that Evo knew this coup was coming. In fact, there is a very interesting interview published before the election, before October 20th. And in this interview, Evo Morales said, I have proof that there is a coup coming, that if I win the election, they're going to overthrow me in a coup. And he said, how do I know that? We have audio recordings that show that the opposition is conspiring with foreign countries, including with the US, including with Brazil, including with the European Union. And these audio recordings of opposition figures cite specifically Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz and Bob Menendez as supposedly, allegedly, as senators.
As well as Ivan Duque, the right-wing president of Colombia, his mentor, Alvaro Uribe. Bolsonaro is cited as someone who's on board. Of course, we saw Camacho, the coup leader, actually make pilgrimages to those countries in May to get them on board, and also plans to set government buildings on fire, to get pro-business unions out, to carry out strikes, all straight out of the CIA destabilization playbook.
Yeah, and again, I need to stress this point that these audio recordings, I actually got access to these recordings. I found a link to them before the election took place. But the thing is, I couldn't confirm them. I didn't know if they were real, so I couldn't report on them. But again, Evo Morales said before the election, he said, I have these audio recordings that prove that the opposition is planning a coup. And up on the screen here, for those watching, I have a part of our article that Max and I just published at the Grayzone, and you can see this photo here is Luis Fernando Camacho, who is the literal fascist who led the coup, this Christian not evangelical, actually Catholic, this Christian extremist fundamentalist who led the coup, and right next to him, to his left, is Ivan Duque, who is the far-right president of Colombia, very far-right, who has basically been trying to tear up the peace accord with the FARC. And then to the left of Ivan Duque is another former president of Colombia. And this was a meeting in May, well before the election. And then also another smoking gun we have that I found, and we were the first people to report on this at the Grayzone, is this tweet from August. This tweet is incredible. Let me explain this, because I know it's in Spanish here. This is Luis Fernando Camacho. This is the coup leader, the extremist, and he's saying that we are not going to stop until we have a real democracy. We will keep on going. And then he's saying we have support, thanks to God, there's hope. And he says, thanks Colombia, thanks Venezuela, thanks Brazil. Of course, when he says thanks Venezuela, he's not referring to the actual democratically elected government of Venezuela. He's referring to the coup leader. And as you can see here, this photo shows him with, to his left, the other guy, the old guy, is Gustavo Tarre. Tarre is the fake Venezuelan ambassador to the Organization of American States of the coup regime. And the photo behind him is Juan Guaido, who is the fake president of Venezuela, who 3/4 of the world does not recognize. The U.S. claims that he's the president of Venezuela. He controls nothing. He never won an election. He's not elected. And you can see that these photos are from August. So 2 months before the election, the coup leader was meeting not only with the Colombian far-right president, he was also meeting with the Venezuelan U.S.-backed opposition, because of course they were all planning the coup together. And these audio recordings prove they have Bolivian opposition officials and military officials discussing in meticulous detail the plans. And what's so wild is that in this interview, Evo Morales said, "I know they're planning a coup against me if I win the election." And he didn't just say it. He said, the coup is going to be based in Santa Cruz, based in a civic organization, which is an obvious reference to the Pro Santa Cruz Committee, the Comité Pro Santa Cruz, which is the Comité Cívico, which is the civic committee, which is the group led by the coup leaders. So Evo Morales and the intelligence services knew, it's clear that they knew that a coup was planned, and they knew by name who was going to carry it out. So, we're just beginning to scratch the surface of a very, very dirty operation here. And I think this, in many ways, echoes the famous CIA coup against Salvador Allende in 1973, the first 9/11. And these people claiming that the U.S. is not involved, just look at the White House statement. I mean, it's one thing that the White House, of course, recognizes the coup regime, but it's worse than that. I'm going to get at the statement here because Trump actually rubs it in. Trump specifically says this is a warning to the so-called illegitimate regimes in Nicaragua and Venezuela. So not only does Trump and the White House call this a supposed victory for democracy, at the same time, he's warning Venezuela, which is enduring multiple U.S. coup attempts throughout this year, and also Nicaragua, which last year suffered from a coup attempt that failed. So maybe, Max, you can jump in because we were in Nicaragua this summer, and you were in Nicaragua last year during the end of the failed coup attempt. And you can talk, and I'll get up the White House statement while we jump to Max here.
Well, the difference in Nicaragua is the same thing in Venezuela. Their police forces and military were reformed over the years, and especially the police by Tomas Borges. And the police have one of the best records in Central America of kind of community policing. They don't have the same violence that you see in the Northern Triangle. You don't have Mara Saltrucha. You don't have those same problems because of the awareness that the Sandinistas had first of preventing CIA penetration and also, keeping drug cartels out. Drug cartels have been used actually as a weapon of destabilization in Venezuela. So when you saw the Bachelet report by the curiously quiet Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile, who has nothing to say about the violence in her country, indicting Venezuela and accusing them of mass extermination by their FICE sort of special police, who are like, specially trained security forces. They're accused of thousands and thousands and thousands of killings. I think the number is inflated and exaggerated. Most of the allegations contained in the Bachelet report, by the way, she's the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner, so it's a UN report. They were based on innuendo, rumors, and distortions of half-truths by an opposition that is largely based now outside of Venezuela. But there were raging battles inside areas of Caracas and other cities between narco cartels and the special police. And it's to prevent Venezuela from turning into Colombia and to prevent these groups from destabilizing the country, which have close links to Colombia. And Colombia functions as what? The Israel of South America. It's a U.S. anchor
to famously quote Hugo Chavez.
Inside the continent. Yeah, I think there were many people who were killed, but this is, as many Venezuelans explained to me, something that was done with kind of national interest in mind to prevent areas from becoming ungovernable and controlled by criminal gangs. So you don't. I mean, you have a huge crime problem in Venezuela. In Nicaragua, it's the least violent country in Central America. So again, Evo Morales was unable to carry out those kinds of reforms in the last 13 years. And you actually, you saw these pathetic attacks in some left-wing alternative media or left-wing media on Morales for not being, purely anti-capitalist enough. And that's because it's really difficult to come into power and then deal with a separatist region like Santa Cruz, where the landowners don't even want to pay taxes and are trying to secede. So what he was able to do is at least get them to participate in national life and held off a secessionist movement for this long. But then you had a military that was supplied down to their boots by the U.S. and whose leadership was completely cultivated by the School of the Americas and all of these military and police exchange programs.
And if I can jump in for a second, you mentioned the so-called autonomy movement in Santa Cruz, which is the largest city in Bolivia and also the richest area. And I have up on the screen here, this is a part of our article. And again, for anyone who's interested, you could check out at the Grayzone. This is the article Max and I published, Bolivia coup led by Christian fascist paramilitary leader and millionaire with foreign support. But in this article, we looked through some of the WikiLeaks cables, and they show that Carlos Mesa, who was the opposition presidential candidate, was regularly corresponding with the U.S. government. But in addition to that, the U.S. government for years was also supporting the Santa Cruz secessionist movement because the U.S. was trying to balkanize Bolivia because they recognized that if the right wing can't win an election, then they can at least try to create an autonomous region where the right wing rules and can be allied with the U.S. Of course, I mean, something we didn't even stress in this, which we should have earlier, is that, not only is Evo Morales a leftist, not only did he, nationalize the natural resources like the gas and part of the lithium, but also Evo Morales was a major voice of anti-imperialism. And I invite anyone watching, there are incredible clips. In fact, I'll get some of the clips when other people are talking.
One clip to bring up is that the UN, after the Syrian government was accused of chemical attack or sarin gas attack. This might have been 2018 or 2017, which of course triggered U.S. airstrikes on Syria across the red line. And as a former Obama advisor told Harper's, a red line is a recipe for a false flag. It was the Bolivian UN delegation that invoked the WMD pretext for the Iraq war and just really threw it back in the face of the U.S. And defended Syria's sovereignty at the UN. That is the kind of thing that infuriates the United States, along with kicking the DEA out, something that Evo Morales absolutely had to do because the DEA was the ultimate U.S. cat's paw in Latin America.
Yeah, actually, I have this video up here. This is from one of his speeches. This is one of Evo Morales' speeches at the United Nations.
Si así fuera, no
I'll
habría...
go back a little bit. So that you can see there why the U.S. would be opposed to this kind of leader. I mean, again, we mentioned all. Yeah, well, one of his most famous quotes that he repeats all the time is he says, to be indigenous and to be part of the anti-imperialist left is our crime. And that's exactly right.
Of Bolivia, which is a city that...
Max, you had an audio issue. Can you start... No. Max, you had an audio issue. Can you start that line over again and say that you had another friend? Yeah.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, the audio issue's fixed. Yeah.
I'm just getting an update in from a friend who actually got into Bolivia before the election and is in Cochabamba, and sending me some photos of some of the roadblocks that are being set up there. And he says, this is just an example of what people are doing here in Cochabamba in their attempt to paralyze the city. It is at times virtually impossible to get from point A to point B. It's affected the economy of many sectors, but that's met with chance of the blockade has its cost, but freedom has no price. People have been unable to send kids to school, and with small exception, it has brought the city to an almost standstill. These blockades are being carried out by the opposition in an attempt to prevent the cocaleros, the coca farmers and the indigenous population from getting into the city or the members of the mining union. Every street has some form of blockade, and there are barely any vehicles that are able to pass through. This contact says many people there might not consider themselves right wing. Some are former supporters of Evo, but they are trying to basically shut the city down and keep it off limits to supporters of the deposed president.
Yeah, so I mean that says everything.
It's like Guarimbas in Venezuela, where they're basically just taking over areas. They were supposed to end when this new Juan Guaido with makeup declared herself president today, but obviously they haven't ended. The question is, do they alienate themselves from the local population, and does this lead to violence?
Yeah, well, Max doesn't have a lot of more time here. We'll be wrapping up here in about 10 to 15 minutes, or at least Max will go, and maybe we'll answer some of your questions.
Are there any more questions? Or
well, the first thing I want to do is, so there are some questions and some super chat people here I want to recognize. We're still going to maybe conclude it with another comment on Bolivia, so we're not done yet talking about it, so stay with us. But I want to thank Tim Owen, who said the great work, and thanks for the super chat. Sage and Fool, I partially answered your question earlier about the 47% of people who voted for Morales and whether or not you think they're going to go. Well, of course they're not going to go quietly, and Max has been talking about the massive protests. And also, bear with us. Thanks for telling us about the audio issues. I know this is our second live stream ever, but I think this time it was much more successful, and we've only had a few minor issues. Thanks to Gary Curtis. Thanks a lot. We appreciate all these donations so much. I mean, it really helps us. We're a small group at the Grayzone, and it really helps us to keep this independent journalism going. Thanks to Fadi as well. My heart aches for Bolivia. Really appreciate it. And is there any other questions you all see that you should answer?
Ben, you had one. This one's tailor-made for you, but I'm going to ask you to limit your response here because we only have time. Can you talk about what in Trotsky's ideology that seeps into modern-day anarchists, democratic socialists, and even neoconservatives? And
I thought someone would want to know who killed James Le Mercier. I mean Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, the reason I asked this question is because it came from Captain Waffles, who generously gave $5. So thank you, Captain Waffles. But also because I do think there's a relevance here to Bolivia.
Well, all I'll say on this is that this could be a long discussion that I'd be happy to have in a different forum. But I will say that the short of it is that it's not unique necessarily to Trotskyism, but it's this idea it's actually related to Bolivia. This left opposition and this obsession with ideological and political purity, and this idea that once people are in power, people on the left are in power, you have to make compromises, and that's not a justification for crimes and mistakes that people in power have made, but rather a reality that governing is really hard, and oftentimes people on the left who claim to be on the left become neoliberals and move to the center because it's so difficult to govern. And other times, people who are on the left like Evo Morales and Hugo Chavez and these other figures, they try to do the best they can. And yeah, it's extremely difficult to govern, especially when you're governing in a society where you're voted in still in the confines of this bourgeois, so-called democracy, where the way democracy is determined, every 4 years you go to the voting booth and you elect someone, and that's supposedly your democracy. And in those confines, the president is often not very strong, or the prime minister is often pretty weak, as we can see with the war against Evo Morales, as we can see where, for instance, if in the next election in December, if Jeremy Corbyn wins, he's going to be a very weak prime minister who's facing attacks from his own government. So frequently there's this left opposition
facing a very British coup.
Exactly. So frequently there's this left opposition refuses to recognize how difficult it is to govern, and they become part of they are attracted to this idea that it's not a real socialist government, it's not a real socialist society, it's degenerated worker state, it's a bureaucracy, whatever. And frequently that left opposition often finds common ground with the right-wing opposition. And frequently there's an attempt by intelligence agencies, not just by the US, but other governments, to court those left-wing opposition forces who live in the US, who live in exile in other countries, who are funded by large foundations, by the Ford Foundation, by billionaires, by whatever, who for their own interests have like a kind of vested interest in supporting the left opposition against the actual left-wing forces in government to unseat the government, because they know that if they unseat the government, the left-wing opposition is not going to come in power. The best example of this is the MRS in Nicaragua, the movement for the renovation of Sandinismo. These are the forces who left the Sandinista movement, claiming that it wasn't progressive and leftist and socialist and pure enough. And these are people who claim to be the real leftists in Nicaragua. Meanwhile, they're funded by the U.S. government. They meet and work with the U.S. government, as WikiLeaks cables show. And then WikiLeaks is a good example of this. There's all these people on the left who attack WikiLeaks for not having like a pure leftist ideology. But the thing is, WikiLeaks has done more damage to imperialism and to existing, systems of extreme power and concentration of billionaires, the International Monetary Fund, the European Union, these authoritarian institutions that control politics. WikiLeaks has done more to expose their crimes than anyone else. But again, you see this obsession with ideological purity. So it makes sense why a lot of these former Trotskyites who could never be content with any time a government was in power, it was never pure enough, it was never socialist enough, they always were attacking it, and they moved to the right over time, and they became neocons because their view of politics is all ideology and theory, and it's never the actual, the difficulty of actually governing. So their entire lives they've always been in the opposition, and it's very easy to be in the opposition. It's very difficult to be in power and to govern.
We are getting a lot of questions about James Lemercier, the founder of the White Helmets. Do you guys want to talk about that briefly?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was trying to avoid talking about it on Twitter, but I feel like I'm sort of in a safe space here.
All right. Well, you are in a safe space, Max.
I don't want to.
Anything you say can and will be used against you.
Let me do a quick introduction for this, because we're going to use this and publish this on Pushback, another safe space.
Okay, sure.
So we are with...
Do I have sound? I better fucking have sound.
You have sound. You have sound, Max.
So we are with Ben Norton and a very angry Max Blumenthal.
I'm Kristen.
Oops. Sorry about that. I got that. So we are with Ben Norton and Max Blumenthal, and we are talking now briefly about James Lemercier, the founder of the White Helmets, a former British spy. He was found dead in Turkey. Cause of death is said to be a suicide, but details are still unclear.
Is it said to be a suicide, Aaron?
Well, that's what people are saying, and I'm going to ask you about it, Max. The James Lemercier founded the White Helmets, former British spy. They're known around the world for saving lives in Syria, but reporting by Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton has exposed that the White Helmets also work in concert with Al-Qaeda and in many ways serve their interests. And a really explosive investigative report by Max Blumenthal in the Grayzone showed that the White Helmets were actually a part of essentially a PR campaign to manufacture support for the proxy war in Syria. So, Max, as you get the news and the available details of James Lemercier's death, can you talk about who he was and your thoughts on his passing?
Thanks, Aaron. I think it's much more plausible that James Lemercier's death was an accident than Jeffrey Epstein's. Not that there's anything in common with between the two, except the mysterious circumstances surrounding their death. And a lot of strange things have happened around the Syrian proxy war.
Well, not to cut you off, just to be on the record, I will go on the record saying I think there is a 0.0001% chance that Epstein killed himself. But anyway, you can keep going, Max.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Basically, everyone agrees with you. And during my time in my recent period in prison, I spent a lot of my time in my cell trying to figure out how Epstein would have killed himself. It seemed really difficult. I mean, the top bunk is really low. I don't know how you're going to...
While we're on this, by the way, I just got to say something. One of the funniest things I saw recently, which is the best example of the difference between Bernie Sanders supporters and Elizabeth Warren supporters, is a recent poll found that a large majority of Bernie Sanders supporters think that Epstein was killed, obviously, and a majority of Elizabeth Warren supporters were like, no, he killed himself, obviously, which honestly is like the best. That not even like your views on universal healthcare. That question alone is like the best example of that is the best symbol of the difference between Bernie and Elizabeth supporters.
Yeah, there's a clear difference in sort of sensibility between Sanders supporters and Warren supporters. And if Elizabeth Warren somehow, if this smug dork gets elected somehow against Trump, she's going to bring some of the most annoying people to Washington to replace, the pirate ship that Donald Trump brought here of like weird, reclusive Stephen Miller white supremacists. But I thought we were supposed to talk about James Lemercier.
Yes.
Sorry, we're not going to be able to do that. I have to. No, just kidding. Ben's interruptions prevented this from happening. But no, James Lemercier's death may have been an accident. Here's what we know from Turkish media, the Turkish state media, as what I've seen reporting on this. And the same Turkish state media that did the kind of drip, drip, drip on Khashoggi's death. He lived in a very secure home in Istanbul that could only be entered by, fingerprint, keyless entry. His wife went to bed with him and was woken up by the sound of police at her door, knocking on her door to tell her that her husband had died falling from a balcony. There were fractures in his legs and maybe his hands to suggest that he was trying to prevent his fall from a second floor balcony. That's all we know. I saw some chatter about him being on antidepressants, but I don't know about a suicide. There was another strange event in Istanbul last year. And Istanbul and Turkey are, the base of the Syrian proxy war. That's where all of the weapons and all of the kind of civil society groups supported by USAID, like the White Helmets that Lemercier founded, it went across the Turkish border in Sirlik Air Base, a Turkish air base where the U.S. maintained a strong presence, was basically where the arm and equip operation to arm the so-called moderate rebels took place. And, those moderate rebels have been repurposed by Turkey to carry out atrocities in northern Syria, and Samantha Power and all the Obama people are furious about these atrocities carried out by these same groups that they armed and equipped. So there's an irony there. Turkey remains, a base of NATO destabilization of Syria. And Lemercier, I didn't know he was living there. He's right there in the middle of it. The White Helmets have sort of, faded from the scene, but everyone watching this, or almost everyone watching this, will understand that the White Helmets were backed with maybe as much as $100 million by the U.S. and the UK Foreign Office, not just to rescue people. I don't know how many people they rescued, but they just claim, we've rescued like 50 million people, 100,000 people. They just arbitrarily make up these numbers. It's like they've rescued like 1/10 of Syria's entire population. What they really were was an influence operation. And they were, not just providing these HD cameras provided by the State Department to the so-called rescuers to just film themselves running with babies through rubble, but also to film bombings and to basically create this image of the Syrian war as a one-sided conflict of a cat-petting, bloodthirsty dictator against his own people. But they had a media center in Gaziantep, which is like Spooksville in southern Turkey, where they cut up and manipulated footage, basically, and then handed it over to a media that was unable to get into these areas, not because it was so dangerous because of bombing, but because being among the moderate rebels would wind you up like James Foley, and you'd lose your head. Meanwhile, the Western correspondents, the blue check marks, and all the anarcho-neocons who hate us and basically devote their lives to writing these articles and hit pieces about us, they worshipped the white helmets, and they feasted on the white helmets because that was their source. And you've seen some of these same people who've been attacking us and even celebrating me being arrested on false charges, memorialize James LeMessurier as their great friend. So he was obviously in the middle of the entire Syria propaganda operation, down to some of the most pivotal events. Now, I wrote in The Management of Savagery, my book, about how when the Syrian regime change lobby failed to get the Obama administration to fully intervene in Syria after the red line was tripped through the alleged chemical attack in Ghouta in 2013, another very mysterious event. And Obama cut this deal through the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to hand over Syria's chemical and biological weapons stockpiles and bring the OPCW in. They started kind of investing more resources into arming the rebels, but also into propaganda. And that really led up to the Khan Sheikhoun incident in the al-Qaeda-controlled province of Idlib, where there was an allegation of a sarin gas attack, images through the White Helmets media accounts with White Helmets immediately on the ground, treating supposed sarin victims without gloves to tell the world that this chemical attack had just happened to trigger U.S. bombing successfully. So in a way, all the propaganda investment, the investment in the influence operation kind of paid off. And then we saw the Duma, the Duma situation where, once again, the Syrian army was advancing, was winning, and had no reason to carry out a chemical attack. And in this area, in the eastern suburbs of Damascus, which I visited earlier this year, actually pretty recently, there was the White Helmets again on the scene, alleging that these people who had been found dead had been the victims of another chemical attack. And on the basis of those images, with no evidence, the U.S. bombed Syria once again. The Duma attack was the most implausible one. And now we've seen, and Aaron, you can talk about this a little bit more, whistleblowers from the OPCW come out and actually call bullshit on the whole thing. But just being in Syria and talking to Syrians, including someone who lived in Duma, they said we were watching the whole operation take place, and there was absolutely no way, but with the government just rapidly taking territory, one militia after another giving up, that a chemical attack could have taken place or did take place. But the point is that the White Helmets have been pivotal.
Well, I'll jump in for a second on that note. For people watching on YouTube, after this live stream is over, you should go to our channel, and we actually have a video here. We published this, I made this video that looks at the second whistleblower from the OPCW who says that the Duma so-called gas attack was probably staged. And what's crazy about this segment in this video we posted, which you can watch after the live stream, is that it includes a BBC interview with an award-winning former The Guardian journalist who managed to get on the BBC. So it's surreal, because for the first time on the BBC, you actually hear the truth on Syria, because the BBC's, of course, been pushing regime change propaganda for years now.
So one final point, because I think the last point, is well understood about the White Helmets' role in kind of attempting to trigger military intervention under false pretenses, is that many people who supported the White Helmets and supported regime change in Syria took to Twitter after Le Mercurier was found dead and attempted to implicate Russia in killing him somehow. Just some of the usual kind of propaganda freaks on Twitter, and they get thousands of retweets for this. The woman who tried to fundraise to go to Hawaii and have a vacation, where she said she was going to investigate Tulsi Gabbard's ties, Caroline Orr, she was trying to implicate Russia in killing Le Mercurier. And these are people that call us conspiracy theorists for presenting conspiracy facts. Here's something, I don't like to engage in conspiracy theories. I like to engage in factual, reality-based journalism. And so here is what is established by the fact. The White Helmets that were founded by James Le Mercurier, a former British military officer and former mercenary for the United Arab Emirates, who spent much of his time in Turkey and founded the White Helmets in Turkey, worked hand in glove with every faction that we can think of that was involved in trying to topple the Syrian government, including Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the rebranded version of Al-Qaeda, the organization responsible for killing over 3,000 Americans on 9/11, and ISIS. A lot of people don't know that the White Helmets were documented working with ISIS. The documentation arrived courtesy of John Cantley, a British photojournalist who has been forced in hostage videos to carry out propaganda reports for ISIS on camera. And in one of his propaganda reports, which I tweeted, he's referring to the Islamic State's fire brigade behind him. And they are members of the White Helmets, I think in northern Aleppo at the time of this hostage video, who are just running around in the White Helmets uniforms that are paid for by the U.S. taxpayer. And this is an organization that is nominated again for a Nobel Prize this year, thanks to a submission by Erwin Kotler, who's this right-wing pro-Israel lawyer in Canada. This is a group that had a documentary that wasn't that good made about it that won an Oscar. I mean, they were celebrated at the Oscar ceremonies, and they were working hand in glove with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, some of the worst, most blood-stained fanatics on earth. And Ben and I have reported at the Grayzone and made a lot of people really upset because it was factual that the White Helmets have been involved in field executions and executions of people who violated the theocratic law imposed by these Salafi jihadi fanatics in the areas where they control. So this is one of the biggest scandals of our times, and it's always dismissed as Russian propaganda. It's never interrogated, but it's just well established. So
and amazingly,
where are the White Helmets now?
Well,
just really quickly,
yeah.
The White Helmets have been, this is the end of the White Helmets. Le Mercurier is gone. This really is the final chapter of the White Helmets. In the south of Syria, the White Helmets were evacuated, or 800 so-called White Helmets families were evacuated with the help of the Israeli intelligence services and the Israeli military through the occupied Syrian Golan Heights and into Jordan. So anyone who is in the Palestine Solidarity Movement who celebrated this group, there you go. I have nothing more to say except to look at that as what the White Helmets always were. And then in the north, the White Helmets were active in the Turkish assault on Afrin, in which Kurdish fighters and Kurdish people were heinously abused, tortured, and killed. And the center of Afrin was looted. And I question whether the White Helmets are involved in the subsequent Turkish activity this year, which has been condemned across the board in the U.S. But this is the legacy that James Le Mercurier has left behind. There's no reason to celebrate his death. There is going to be a reason to celebrate Dick Cheney's death. But I'm going to come out and I'm just going to dance in the street when Dick Cheney dies because I hate him. And he's killed so many people. And I don't.
Kissinger. Let's not get too far ahead here.
Kissinger will probably outlive me. I mean,
yeah.
And Cheney has like some like
the blood of all the victims. He's like Highlander.
Le Mercurier has a very, very dark legacy, and he is responsible for playing a key role in a proxy war that has ruined the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. He's not a hero.
And wait, while I have this up, for viewers here, you can go to the Grayzone and you can find, Max mentioned, he has a 2-part deep investigative report looking at the White Helmets And in this part I have up how the White Helmets became international heroes while pushing U.S. military intervention, regime change in Syria. He talks about Le Mesurier and these figures. So go to thegrayzone.com. And another point I wanted to mention, by the way, is that you know who recently just gave the White Helmets $4.5 million more is
Donald
actually
J.
the Trump White House.
Donald J. Trump.
And the photo up here I have shows some of the White Helmets volunteers who are actually sometimes have been photographed carrying weapons. And this is a guy who was hanging out in Idlib when Idlib was taken over by Al-Qaeda with its allies. This is a Salafi jihadist group called Jaish al-Sunnah, and he's holding one of their flags, and this is a White Helmets guy. So, this is an established fact. The idea that they're a strictly humanitarian organization that's not political, I mean, that's just a fantasy, and no one really believes that. But, so
Max has to leave us, right, Max? So we're going to say goodbye to you.
Yeah, I'm supposed to do another interview, but thanks everyone for supporting the Grayzone and for checking my audio.
Yeah.
Checking his mic.
Aaron and I aren't leaving yet. We are going to answer some of your questions before we sign off, so we'll spend a few more minutes.
And finally, thanks everyone for supporting me on this completely bogus charge that I'm facing. It's meant a lot to me, and it's really rallied our side. So I just wanted everyone to know how much it means to me. I wish there was something I could ask everyone to do right now, but all I know is I have a status hearing coming up, and if the government wants to take this lie, this complete sham to trial, I'm just going to have to let the facts speak for themselves, and they're going to speak very loudly. So, thanks again for all the solidarity.
Thank you, Max. And we're going to have to fundraise for Max's legal defense if it does go to trial.
Well, I haven't decided what the next step is. So let's just kind of stay tuned.
All right. Fair enough. I wanted to say...
all right, well, Max is signing off now, so thanks a lot, Max.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Max. So we'll talk a bit more, and then we'll take some questions and sign off. I wanted to say about Duma, Max was talking about that and how the White Helmets were involved there, and he mentioned that there have been whistleblowers. Speaking of scandals, this should be among the biggest scandals in the world right now. Right now, we have not one, but now two whistleblowers from the world's top chemical weapons watchdog, the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. The first whistleblower emerged earlier this year when he leaked an engineering assessment that had been suppressed by the OPCW. And instead of weighing the facts presented in this engineering assessment, the OPCW put out a conclusion that basically corroborated the allegation that the Syrian government was responsible for the chemical weapons attack in Douma in April 2018. This buried engineering assessment that was not presented to the public totally undermined that, said that the facts show that the cylinders at the scene were likely manually placed, which suggests that the attack was staged. It contained a reference to the OPCW's reliance on supposed experts, which that right there should have been a major scandal. You have somebody from inside the world's top chemical weapons watchdog leaking something that undermines a finding that was used to justify U.S. military airstrikes. It got almost no coverage in the U.S. except for at outlets like the Grayzone. Now we have a second whistleblower from the OPCW, somebody who was on the ground, who was collecting chemical samples, and they recently came forward and delivered testimony. This is a senior scientist at the OPCW who was so disturbed by what he saw that he went and delivered testimony before a panel convened by the Courage Foundation, which is a organization founded by WikiLeaks meant to protect whistleblowers and journalists. And whistleblowers right now are very much in style because we're all supposed to be revering the whistleblower at the heart of Ukraine Gate. So this OPCW whistleblower delivered testimony and said that that they collected chemical samples on the ground, and they found that the chemicals collected outside the site of the alleged attack were basically no different than the chemicals collected inside the site of the alleged attack. So basically, whatever chemical traces they picked up were just basically everyday chemicals. But this whistleblower says that all this evidence was ignored by the OPCW's leaders, and who then published this finding. And the tie-in here to the White Helmets that Max was talking about is there because according to sources I've spoken to who are very familiar with this whistleblower's testimony, this whistleblower says that the OPCW's conclusions relied on evidence that was provided by groups that were on the ground working with and actually directly working for the White Helmets, who, as Max laid out before, has connections to Al-Qaeda and other jihadists. So this should be a major scandal, the fact that a whistleblower from this organization is saying that. But if you look at the coverage here, it's basically gotten nothing. We'll have more coming out on pushback in the coming days. I recently spoke to Professor Ted Postal of MIT about this, and we'll be speaking to others, including some of the people who heard the whistleblower's testimony. Which, by the way, this panel includes, the panel that heard the whistleblower's testimony includes Jose Bustani, who was the OPCW's first director general, and he was forced out of his job by John Bolton, basically because Bustani was standing in the way of the Bush administration's drive to invade Iraq. And Bustani came out with a statement saying how concerned he was and troubled he was by this whistleblower's testimony. So it's a crazy story, but yet you look at here in the U.S. and, you know, from mainstream media even to progressive adversarial media, it's been silenced. And, you know, it's part of a pattern that I've witnessed just looking at Ben and Max and Rania and others who have tried to bring some accuracy to the serious story and seeing how their voices have been marginalized. And here you have the starkest case where a whistleblower, two whistleblowers from the OPCW are challenging a claim that was made to justify a Trump administration airstrike, and that's being silenced too.
And not just a U.S. airstrike, but a British and a French attack as well.
Yeah.
And I'm going to cut to here. You can see this is an article by Aaron that's specifically on the alleged gas attack, and it includes the interview with the actual rocket scientist, Ted Postal. and you can find that at the Grayzone. I also put the link to that in the comments. So we're going to wrap up in a few minutes here, but before we do, we're going to, I guess, respond to some of the questions and comments people had, because there's so many of them, and I see we're getting trolled by some regime changers too, but cool. Thanks for joining us.
All are welcome. All are welcome.
Cool to have more viewers. So is there any questions that you saw so far?
I am humbled by all the kind words we're getting, all the words of support. We really appreciate it. Not easy doing the kind of work we do. We don't win too many friends in our field by doing it. So we really appreciate the support of our viewers. So thank you. I am perusing for questions,
First of all, I do want to say thank you to everyone, especially, I mean, we appreciate all the commenters except the regime change trolls, but we especially are grateful for all the super chat people. Again, you know, it's a cliche, but that support really does help us do
thank you
this
for
original
us.
Investigative journalism.
Thank you.
And we're also planning on doing more live streams like this in the future. So today we were talking about Bolivia, and while Aaron's looking for questions to answer, I'm going to go back and talk a second, because this is what, of course, the live stream is about. This is the report that Max and I just published at the Grayzone. Bolivia coup led by Christian fascist paramilitary leader and millionaire with foreign support. It's a shocking story. Honestly, it was pretty shocking writing it. You know, these people are literal. I mean, you know, people often throw around the word fascist kind of as an insult, so it doesn't mean that much. But these people are actual Nazi saluting fascists. I mean, you can see here, I'm going to play this video of these are youth from this group in Santa Cruz in Bolivia. This is the opposition. And this was, these youth here, which you can see you're about to see are in the Nazi salute, you can see that they were planning an anti-Evo Morales demonstration. And here's the video. What? Woo! So I will put the link to that report in the comments, and it's also below in the description for anyone who wants to read. That is really, so far, unfortunately, one of the only in-depth investigative reports so far on the Bolivian coup leaders.
So Ben, a couple questions about Evo Morales and his safety. I'll put it to you. People asking, is he safe in Mexico, and how long do you think he'll be there for?
Well, it's hard to tell. I mean, the questions, you know, there are certain questions we can answer, but the questions asking about what's going to happen in the future, that's impossible to say. What I'll say is that You know, Max and I just did an interview for Moderate Rebels, which is our podcast and video show you can find on YouTube as well if you look up Moderate Rebels. And we interviewed a journalist in Chile who was reporting on the massive protests there against the far-right, the similarly Trumpian kind of regime there of Sebastián Piñera, who is a billionaire oligarch, super rich, and is a kind of, Pinochet light. Although his government has brutally been cracking down on the protesters, killing dozens of people, shooting protesters in their eyes. And specifically, toward the end of our interview, we start talking about the regional perspective and how Mexico has become a kind of new voice of the left in Latin America and is working for regional integration. And there's a second part of that interview we're going to be publishing. I'll probably post tomorrow or very soon. And in that part, we talk about how in Mexico, this journalist we interviewed was talking about how in Mexico, she's heard that there are actually rumors that a coup is also potentially being plotted against the president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who goes by AMLO, A-M-L-O. And he is the first progressive left-wing president in 50 years in Mexico. He's really the first president who's not a puppet of the U.S. in decades. And Mexico has a history of coups against the revolutionary leaders after the Mexican Revolution and its progressive leaders. So, the fact that Mexico gave refuge to Evo Morales is a significant symbolic step. But of course, it's also going to be another example of how Andrés Manuel is being targeted there. So I can't answer how long he'll be there because, it also depends on what's going to happen. The question that we should be asking is there going to be an election? Because Evo Morales said, I'm stepping down to avoid a war. And a quick note on this. Evo Morales stepped down because the military told him. So it wasn't voluntary. He was trying to avoid a civil war. You can look at what happened in Syria. You can look in other countries. Evo Morales said explicitly, I will always remain an anti-imperialist. I will always support the Bolivian people. I stepped down because the military told me to, and I didn't want violence. And there is violence right now, and the violence could have potentially been worse if he stayed. Who knows what would have happened? But the question is the military regime, backed by the US, Colombia, and Brazil, are they going to actually allow an election, and are they going to allow a fair election? Because what we've seen in Honduras, Max and I were in Honduras this summer, in June and July, and we interviewed the former democratically elected president, Manuel Zelaya. This is a guy who, when he was elected, was not even really left-wing, and he moved to the left when he realized how much corporations control politics in Honduras, how little sovereignty Honduras actually had. And he was told by the Bush administration, by John Negroponte, who was formerly a Reagan official who had trained death squads in Central America during the Dirty Wars, and then was brought into the Bush administration along with all the neocons. And John Negroponte told Manuel Zelaya, the elected president of Honduras, he said, you cannot have relations with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. If you have relations with him, you're going to face problems. And what happened is Zelaya he joined this trade alliance, the ALBA, that was led by Venezuela and the progressive government of Lula in Brazil, and he was immediately couped out in a U.S. coup. So what has happened in the past 10 years in Honduras? They have one of the most corrupt governments in the entire world, where a few weeks ago, there wasn't much coverage of this. There was like a bleep of coverage in the mainstream media and then it disappeared, where a U.S. court acknowledged that the president, the unelected dictator who steals the elections in Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, his brother was implicated in trafficking tons of cocaine and machine guns into the U.S. So Honduras has essentially become like a big colony which has the largest U.S. military base in Latin America and which is used to smuggle drugs, huge amounts of drugs. And this U.S. court case revealed, in fact, that El Chapo Guzman, the most famous drug dealer in the world, personally gave $1 million to Tony Hernandez, the brother of the Honduran dictator backed by the U.S., to fund his government, his regime. And they've been shooting protesters in the street, with little coverage. So You can go to our coverage at the Grayzone. But the point is, why do I mention all of that? That is an example of what the future of Bolivia could look like if there's not actually a fair election. If this coup continues and there's not, the possibility of the Bolivian people to decide who their next leader is. So, that's the best I could say to that answer.
To me, the question is, what are we going to do here? What's going to happen in the U.S.? Because all this cannot happen without the U.S. supporting it. And in history, whenever there's somewhat of a basis of opposition to what the U.S. is doing in South America and Central America, it can make a difference. Like in the 80s, solidarity with Nicaragua helped in some ways slow part of the war on the Sandinistas, although not entirely, obviously. I'm reminded of what happened with Haiti twice. So Aristide in the early 90s and then again in 2004. And again, it's striking the parallel. These are two of the poorest countries in the Americas. They elect a president who comes from the poor, from the lower classes. They get and gets overthrown. So what happened with Aristide is he first was overthrown, and he spent years in exile. And he basically only could come back to Haiti after he accepted the program of the candidate that he defeated in the initial elections that was imposed by Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton basically made him accept neoliberal economics, and that's when he can come back. But of course, when Aristide tried to turn again independent and nationalist, the Bush administration undermined him and cut off aid and supported the forces against him, and he was overthrown in 2004. He spent many years in exile as well. So that might be the case again here with Evo. I mean, we can't tell, but it's worth reminding that poor countries like this, and leaders where their constituency is the poor, not the elites of their country, and who meanwhile face the opposition of elites in the north, as exemplified, for example, by the New York Times. Let me read to you from the New York Times editorial to show you the obstacles that Evo Morales faces, because unless the U.S. will put pressure on his return, it won't happen. And it's going to be hard for that to happen when you have the bipartisan foreign policy establishment applauding this coup. So, for example, take the New York Times, the heart of liberal opinion. They say this: when a leader resorts to brazenly abusing the power and institutions put in his care by the electorate, as President Evo Morales did in Bolivia, it is he who sheds his legitimacy, and forcing him out often becomes the only remaining option.
And keep in mind, that's the New York Times editorial board endorsing the coup.
So the prospects of his return very much depends on what happens here, and what happens here depends on us, and depends on what kind of leader we're going to put in office in 2020. And it's striking to see, as we talked about earlier, I think, that Bernie Sanders has been the only presidential candidate that I've seen so far. Maybe Tulsi Gabbard said something that I missed, to come out and condemn this. Although even there, he had to qualify what he said. He said this appears to be a coup.
Appears to be a coup.
So which shows
it's blatantly a coup. Yeah, it's a textbook example.
Which shows the impediments to as much integrity as Bernie Sanders has, especially on domestic issues. You can see the pressures there on candidates like him to toe the line when it comes to foreign policy. We're going to wrap up, Ben. So
a few final things. One, I was going to say, on the note of the New York Times editorial board rubber stamping yet another coup. They rubber stamped the 2002 U.S. coup against Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, although because he was part of the military rebelled and brought him back. And the thing about Evo is Evo was a poor coca farmer, and he'd never really controlled his own military. As Max mentioned, we're going to have a report of the Grayzone talking about how all of these top military commanders in Bolivia were in fact trained at the U.S. School of the Americas. So governing is really hard, and in many ways, Evo wasn't even really in control of large parts of the state. But on that note of the New York Times rubber stamping yet another coup, I wrote an article here at the Grayzone. New York Times admits it sends stories to U.S. government for approval. Now, this is not every story, but if you go through the article, it talks about how when the New York Times publishes articles that it deems potentially so-called sensitive to national security, the New York Times admitted that it sends those articles to the U.S. government to make sure that the U.S. is okay, and to multiple government agencies, by the way, and departments, to make sure that they're okay and it's not going to challenge so-called national security. Now, there was a question someone asked that I want to respond to. It wasn't a super chat, just a random question. And someone said, Tom Mott said, what drives these people? I mean, the answer is really simple. It's about profit, power, control. I mean, it's what drives any empire, and it's what drives, this capitalist system, is that the U.S. is the largest empire in the world. And this is not my opinion. We don't have an actual democracy. This is the result of a scientific study done by sociologists at Princeton University, who found that from a scientific statistical perspective, the actual grassroots of U.S. society has a negligible to zero impact on public policy, because it's dictated by the 1%, by the rich, by capitalists. I mean, and that's why, Occupy Wall Street seems like so long ago, and believe me, as someone involved in Occupy Wall Street, I have infinitely many critiques, but the idea of the 1% versus the 99% is simply true. And when you have a leader come into power in any country, but especially in a resource-rich country like Bolivia, which has massive gas and lithium reserves, and you have a leader who is trying to integrate the region, that leader challenges the bottom line of North American corporations and the U.S. government, which acts on their behalf. So it's not even just about the natural resources that Evo used to benefit the population. It's also, this point needs to be stressed, Evo was part of a regional project. In fact, I'm going to get up here. I tweeted out a photo of some of the leaders of the so-called Pink Tide in Latin America. The Pink Tide was this movement that came into power in the beginning really in the late 90s and then in the early 2000s. And it was a series of democratically elected progressive leaders in Latin America. And the thing about them that was important, though, is they were focused on regional integration. They wanted to free South America and Central America and the Caribbean from the 200 years of colonialism exercised by the United States that we call the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. declared that in the 1830s, and now 1820s, and now the Donald Trump administration has been repeatedly invoking it. There are at least 3 Trump administration officials, Donald Trump himself, John Bolton, and Tillerson. All 3 of them invoked the Monroe Doctrine by name, basically saying Latin America is our backyard. But the Pink Tide leaders were trying to unite their region of the world together and cutting out the middleman of the U.S., having trade agreements between Bolivia and Venezuela, between Venezuela and Brazil. So they could trade, Venezuela can give its oil through PetroCaribe and other programs to countries, and then they can trade their wheat because, Venezuela is not food sovereign and things like that. The U.S. fears that because that cuts out the export markets. The U.S. wants to export its goods to all of these countries in Latin America, which keeps them dependent on the U.S. economy. The U.S. doesn't want them to have a dependent economy because that's how you maintain an empire, and that's how you maintain a financial system where your goods are produced in low-wage countries, and then they export those goods to your country, and then you export your goods to their countries for cheap consumer goods. And the goal is that you import the expensive things that are produced, and then you export the cheap things, so countries don't actually have their own domestic economies where they produce. And here's that really quickly. I mean, we're going to wrap up soon, but here is that photo I tweeted, and we need to talk about this for a second, because this is the goal of the U.S. empire, is to overthrow these leftist leaders who have been trying to integrate Latin America and free it from the Monroe Doctrine. And as you can see in this image here, I go through and I look. This is an incredible photo. I mean, obviously without the text I added. This photo showed one of the times when these progressive leaders in Latin America were united and were working together. Of course, on the right here, you have Evo Morales in Bolivia, who was just overthrown, we were talking about today. To his left, you have Daniel Ortega, who's the democratically elected president of Nicaragua. And there was an attempted coup, the most recent coup against him last year, which failed. And then you have, of course, Hugo Chavez, who was there another coup against him in 2002. Manuel Zelaya in Honduras here on the left. And then here you have Rafael Correa, Correa was actually, there was an attempted coup against him in 2008, which failed. And Correa is currently living in exile in Belgium because the current government is trying to imprison him. And then, of course, you have Maduro here, and there's been many coups against him, coup attempts. So it's important to keep in mind that this was a regional project, the Pink Tide, and just this week, Lula da Silva in Brazil was released after being imprisoned on bogus charges. So, there is an attempt to bring back that regional integration, but of course, these coups are what are preventing the region from exercising sovereignty and passing policies and creating programs that will support their poor people, their poor populations. And to stress this, finally, Evo Morales, I mentioned this earlier, Evo Morales, his social spending, his idea was, he wasn't even that radical. His idea was, we're going to take these natural gas resources that have been monopolized by families, oligarchs like the family of the coup leader, Camacho, of Fernando Camacho. His family members are the people who used to control the natural gas, which was nationalized, and they lost part of their wealth. And then what did Evo Morales use the lithium and gas wealth to do? He used it to fund dropping poverty, extreme poverty by over 60%, poverty by over 40%. He used it to create a universal healthcare system, to expand education. So that is what the elites in every country fear, because they know that the 1% capitalist class, they don't pay taxes, and they steal all of the wealth from the people who do work, and they're afraid that if working class people, the 99% actually have a voice in government, then they're going to lose their privileges. So it's really that simple. And imperialism is how that works on an international stage. The U.S. being the richest country in the world, trying to impose its will on poor countries everywhere.
All right, I think that's a great place to wrap. We really appreciate everybody who tuned in, who sent us words of support, and we appreciate your support and your continued viewership of the Grayzone and sharing our work. It's how we do it. It's how we survive. So thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to Max Blumenthal, who we heard from earlier, our editor at the Grayzone, and Ben Norton, who makes this and many other things possible. It's amazing as he's giving you all this analysis, also presenting you with the visuals and doing our sound. And thank you for everyone who gave us...
Well, doing the sound, I kind of failed in some ways.
Well, hey.
I get a C+, B minus. So, and the final thing I'll say is, especially we appreciate all of our viewers, excluding the trolls and regime changers, but especially thank you to all of the Super Chat people. Thank you to Maddie Zabuk for the Super Chat support there. Thank you to Gishhabi, HTD for life, and all of these people.
XX, Oron, XX.
Thank you so much
Andrea,
to
Marita. Thank you, Andrea.
From Australia. Cool to see we have people in Australia. And thank you to Danny O'Brien. And we're making a goal. The idea is we're hoping to have a live stream with Aaron on Pushback at least once a week, maybe more. I'm with those who watch Moderate Rebels. Max and I are going to start trying to do Moderate Rebels live streams. You can find us on YouTube.
I'd watch that.
Yeah, which is going to be pretty fun too. And thanks everyone for keeping tuned. You can always go to thegrayzone.com. That's gray with an A. I'll put a link in the chat before we sign off here in a second. And Aaron, final words for you.
Stay tuned to Pushback. We have some interviews coming up. I think it's just... Listen, I really want to recommend, if you haven't read it yet, go to the Grayzone, read Max and Ben's article about the Bolivian coup leader, Luis Fernando Camacho. It's just... it's so troubling to see the fascists that the U.S. government is now cheering on into power into Bolivia. And what Max and Ben did with their article is something you can't get anywhere else. A deep dive into the interest behind the coup, touching on just evil, fascism, wealth extraction, racism against Bolivia's indigenous culture. It's with even Nazi roots, as we talked about before. So I recommend everyone go to thegrayzone.com and read the article. We'll be bringing you a lot more on the Grayzone every day. And so thank you for tuning in and thank you for your support.
And then I swear this is the last thing, or we're going to sign off in 30 seconds. Someone made a comment. I need to say it. Julian Assange, the most important journalist in the world, is still a political prisoner. He's still suffering from torture. So anything you can say to support him, anything you can do to support him in WikiLeaks. As journalists, it terrifies me every day of my life to see what they're doing. They're torturing this guy whose only crime was publishing truthful information that exposed real crimes of the powerful.
Also, if you haven't watched it yet, do yourself a favor. On the Grayzone YouTube page, we have Anya Parampil's appearance on Al Jazeera, where in 5 minutes she just destroyed all the myths that have been used to justify the U.S.-backed coup in Bolivia. So I really recommend that. If you haven't watched it yet. Thanks to everyone again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time here on the Grayzone.
And subscribe. Everyone watching right now, including our trolls, go down, press subscribe. Love to all of our viewers except the trolls. See ya.